Su presencia, comandante, está viva, está lozana.
I feel something in life, not just a great interior force, but also the power to transmit it to others. It's a fatalistic sense of my mission, which frees me from all fears. Ernesto Che Guevara.
Firme y clara, comandante Che Guevara, del ejemplo de tu vida. Comandante, comandante, comandante Che Guevara, aquí seguimos queriendo la aurora profunda y clara de tu presencia gigante.
Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was born in Rosario, Argentina, on the 14th of May 1928, a day on which Ernesto would never celebrate his birthday. There's a different date on his birth certificate, the 14th of June. With a white lie, his parents had decided to hide a pregnancy out of wedlock. His mother, Celia de la Serna, was the heiress of a family of landowners related to the aristocracy of Spain and the New World. A rebellious girl with aristocratic grace, in Buenos Aires she was one of the first women to wear short hair. She drove a car, signed checks, and crossed her legs in public. His father, Ernesto Guevara Link, was a pleasant and good-looking young man. He was mercurial, like his great-grandfather, who took part in the gold rush in California. He was exuberant and very imaginative. The Guevara family were different. They were chaotic, generous, and intellectually restless. Ernestito, Little Ernest as he was nicknamed, spent the first 2 years of his life in an immense garden, until one day in the spring of 1930, a day which was to have a significant effect on his future personality. On the 2nd of May 1930, after bathing in the frozen water of a swimming pool, he suffered his first asthma attack. It was the beginning of a problem which over the years would force him to forge an iron-like determination. In 1943, the De la Sernas moved to Buenos Aires and Ernesto started high school. World War II was still raging in Europe and his parents supported the solidarity movements for the fight against Nazism. But Ernesto had yet to become involved in politics. I didn't get involved in community activities during my adolescence, and I didn't take part in political or student campaigns in Argentina. Deeply affected by the death of his grandmother in 1947, Ernesto decided to study medicine at the University of Buenos Aires. Exempt from military service because of his asthma, Ernesto, the student, played tennis and golf but excelled at rugby. He played for Estudiantes of Córdoba with the nickname Fuser, an abbreviation of the Furious de la Serna. With his natural enthusiasm, despite his asthma, he became the leader of the team. He also found a magazine called Tackle, and his byline was Chanco, pig. He liked to boast that he rarely washed himself and that he once wore the same rugby shirt for 25 weeks in a row. He took up a position as a nurse on a tanker, worked in the communal slaughterhouses, and then at the university library. With a companion, he invented an insecticide, which he hoped to commercialize. At the same time, he took up an interest in politics. It was the natural result of his readings and perhaps because of the turbulent times he was living in. The succession of coups d'etat, the rise of Perón in Argentina, and so on. So Ernesto started frequenting a group of Marxists at university, but never joined the party. University disappointed him. He was looking for a vocation, while they were talking about a career. During the university vacation, he decided to visit his friend, Alberto Granado, on the Sierra to the north of Córdoba. A medicine graduate, Alberto worked in a leper hospital in San Francisco de Chanar. Ernesto fixed an engine to his bicycle to make the 850-kilometer journey. The only things he took with him were a spare tire, a few clothes, and a book. Cuba, March 2nd, 1952. Military coup d'etat. Backed by the United States, Colonel Fulgencio Batista took power. The island was nicknamed the Brothel of America. Gambling, prostitution, and cabaret. Cuba became a playground for rich Americans. Foreigners controlled the entire economy of the island. Strongly Americanized, the capital city, Havana, became relatively prosperous. But huge shanty towns surrounded the capital. It was a completely different reality. 50% of the population was illiterate, and the people in the countryside lived in the most absolute conditions of hardship and poverty. Pillaging, corruption, Batista was an unscrupulous dictator. A man of the United States, he was the guarantor of their interests on the island. At the end of his holidays, Ernesto returned to Buenos Aires. He crossed the bush and often shared the life of the gauchos. Ernesto was 23 years old and had almost finished his studies in medicine. Hungry for discoveries and adventures, Ernesto decided to undertake another initiatory journey across the whole of Latin America with his friend Alberto Granado. On December 29, 1952, they got onto an old Norton motorbike nicknamed La Poderosa, the Mighty. As they were leaving, his father dropped his revolver amongst his son's equipment. Dr. Granado and his assistant, Guevara, passed through Chile as they crossed the Andes. The Norton motorbike was already breaking down. They hitchhiked as far as Valparaiso, where they secretly boarded a freighter. They went up towards Bolivia and visited the enormous mines exploited by the United States, which revealed to them the enormous socio-political injustice in the treatment of South American workers. Their journey continued towards Peru, Lake Titicaca, Cusco, Machu Picchu, and then in the direction of the Amazon, where they arrived at the San Pablo Leper Hospital. That aimless journey around our America changed me more than I thought. After traveling together for 7 months, the two friends separated. Ernesto had just $1 in his pocket and promised his mother, Celia, that he would return home to finish his studies. The freighter that took him back to Buenos Aires was forced to dock in Miami. While he waited for the ship to be repaired, Ernesto Guevara had to survive for 20 days with just $1. He completed his doctorate in record time. But Dr. Guevara didn't care a bit about this prestigious title. He couldn't wait to set off again. Ernesto arrived in Guatemala, where something new was happening. President Jacopo Arbenz, a progressivist military man, had promised a vast program of reforms. The most important idea was that of bringing to an end the existence of large estates and nationalizing the properties of United Fruit, a very powerful US company. With the support of the Eisenhower administration, the local oligarchy was against the idea. Along the way, I had the chance to see the United Fruit properties. Once again, I was convinced of how terrible these capitalist octopuses are. I will improve myself and acquire what I need to become an authentic revolutionary. In December 1953, Ernesto settled in the capital and met several Cuban exiles who had taken refuge in Guatemala after a failed insurrection attempt led by Fidel Castro against the Batista regime. Led by a young Cuban lawyer, Fidel Castro, they tried to capture the Moncada barracks. The armed assault resulted in carnage, and their leader was captured and condemned to 15 years in prison. In remembrance of the Moncada assault, the group decided to call themselves the 26th of July movement. June 15, 1954. The Eisenhower administration gave the go-ahead to Operation Success. This was a CIA plan which financed the opposition to the government and trained a paramilitary force to invade the country. The situation precipitated in the space of a few weeks. Jacopo Arbenz resigned and left the country in the hands of a new military government loyal to American strategic interests. These were dangerous times for supporters of Arbenz's progressivist government. Ernesto decided to move to Mexico, where his life reached a turning point. While Cuba was rocked by the student protests against Batista's corrupt regime, Fidel Castro was unexpectedly freed from prison and immediately joined his companions in Mexico. July 7th, 1955, Mexico City. Meeting Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro was a political event. An intelligent boy, he's very sure of himself and is extraordinarily courageous. I think there's mutual respect between us. When Ernesto met the volcanic Fidel, it was love at first sight. Castro was looking for a doctor to join the group of revolutionaries that would land in Cuba to overthrow dictator Batista. Guevara didn't think twice. He will carry out the revolution. We're in perfect harmony. Only for someone like him would I give all of myself. At that time, Ernesto was financially dependent on Hilda Gadea, a woman who belonged to the left wing of the Peruvian party, which was there in exile. Just after he met Fidel Castro, Hilda told Che that she was pregnant. He wrote in his diary that he would marry to keep her dignity. From the 15th of February 1956, I am a father. My communist soul expands in an excessive manner. The baby girl came out just like Mao Zedong. At the moment she weighs less than Mao, but she will grow. At last, Castro found a boat to reach Cuba. The Granma was an old cabin cruiser. On board, there were 79 Cuban revolutionaries and 3 foreigners: globe-trotting Argentine doctor Ernesto Guevara, Dominican Ramon Mejias, also known as Pichirillo, and Italian Gino Donné, who was fleeing post-war unemployment. Everything was ready for departure. December 2nd, 1956. It wasn't a landing. It was a shipwreck. The 82 people who landed on the Cuban coastline were decimated by the initial skirmishes with the army. The dozen that survived hid in the Sierra Maestra, a massif 130 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. Up against a 4,000-strong modern army, the guerrillas established relationships with the campesinos, peasants, which progressively boosted their ranks. It was our baptism of fire, the beginning of the formation of what was to become the rebel army. Right during the shootout, I found myself in front of a rucksack full of medicine and a crate of ammunition. The weight stopped me from taking both. I took the crate of ammunition and left the rucksack. In battle, Ernesto Che Guevara found his missing part. He discovered he was unafraid of dying and played a fundamental role in the development and survival of the rebel army. One day, a spy among the rebel army was discovered. It was one of the peasants who had voluntarily joined up. The traitor was unmasked and condemned to death, but nobody was prepared to carry out the execution. Che volunteered himself and wrote about it in his diary, describing the size of the wound caused by the bullet and how the bullet entered and exited the man's brain. He wrote about how calmly he slept that night, without asthma attacks. Without any advance notice, Fidel named Ernesto commander. It was the highest military position in the rebel army. There's a bit of vanity inside every one of us. This appointment made me feel the most important man on earth. From that moment, Ernesto was known by everybody as Commander Guevara. With his men, Che installed a radio transmitter and the typography of a newspaper to spread the word about the actions and conquests of the rebel army. Radio Rebelde brought the voice of the revolutionaries to the whole island. The message was simple: freedom or death.
¡Libertad o muerte! Aquí Radio Rebelde, transmitiendo desde las montañas de Oriente, territorio libre de Cuba.
Commander Guevara set up an out-and-out arms factory which produced bullets, grenades, and even a homemade M26 weapon, which was thrown from a catapult constructed with the springs of an underwater fishing gun. Inside the liberated zone, the rebels paid for their purchases with coupons signed by Ernesto Guevara. Che was a visionary, a mystic, while Fidel was a pragmatist, a realist, and an obstinate politician. Che had no political or diplomatic ability. He didn't mince his words and made enemies in next to no time. If he didn't like someone, he told them directly. He was combative, ideological, and really did think he could change the world. In the summer, Fidel Castro's guerrillas left the mountains and took their fight to the plains. Commander Guevara's column took control of Ladvias province. The island was now split in two. It's very, very difficult to advance. Our comrades' physical conditions are worsening, and eating now and then certainly doesn't help to improve the miserable situation we find ourselves in. It was in this region, considered a starting point of the revolution, where he met his future companion, Aleida Marsh. She was a young and very beautiful woman who joined the secret 26th of July movement in Santa Clara. Aleida arrived at the battleground, where she found Che Guevara, and spent several days there. They became lovers in the mountains. By Christmas, the war was practically won. Only the city of Santa Clara, the cornerstone of Batista's defense, was still to be taken. December 29th, 1958. The battle commenced. Guevara's column besieged the city. The regular army drew up thousands of soldiers and an armored train, which the dictator considered his secret weapon against the revolution. Machine guns spat death from the turrets. Suicide squads doused them with petrol. The armor plating became an oven for the soldiers, who decided to surrender. They all surrendered in just a few hours, with their 22 wagons, cannons, machine guns, and fantastic ammunition supplies. At dawn on January 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista fled to the Dominican Republic, taking with him a veritable fortune. He left the country in the hands of a military junta which uselessly proposed an armistice to Fidel Castro. The rebel army was already marching towards Havana. January 3rd, 1959. Commander Guevara's column entered the capital. Popular enthusiasm was overwhelming. Several days later, Fidel Castro made his own triumphant entry into Havana. The revolution of the Barbudos, as everyone called the Sierra rebels, had won. Che was nominated military governor of the Cabana fortress which faced Havana. It was also where the revolutionary courts were set up. It was here that Batista's executioners were put on trial. With his consent, Che became supreme prosecutor. Hundreds were summarily executed after the trial. Ernesto Che Guevara was just 30 years old and already a legend. The foreigner, the Argentine as they called him in Cuba, would soon receive Cuban citizenship thanks to a clause in the new constitution, written especially for him.
Primero de mayo, principios que fueron, lucha del obrero que se rebeló.
Together with a few trusted companions, Guevara worked on the creation of a secret service for the security of the state. On Fidel's orders, he prepared the agrarian reform promised to the peasants by the revolutionaries. He was nominated Minister for Industry and found himself leading the ambitious Cuba industrialization program. To set up an industrialization process, Cuba must first recuperate its natural resources, which were given to foreign consortiums by the Batista dictatorship. And we must be prepared for the reaction of those who today control 75% of our trade and market. Guevara had clear ideas on the path to take to assert the revolutionary ideals. Redistribution of land to the peasants, the end of the sugar monoculture, nationalization of foreign enterprises, central planning of the economy.
Viva la revolución, viva la reforma agraria, viva Fidel Castro. En un tiempo se vivía oprimidos y sufriendo sin poder decir verdades. Hasta el noble campesino que sufría su pobreza lleno de necesidades. Pero ahora todo es nuevo, en los campos y ciudades todos gritan muy contentos. ¡Viva la revolución!
The social programs included a massive literacy campaign. Trains transported thousands of volunteers from all over the island who wanted to learn to read and write. In 1959, 40% of Cubans were illiterate. It was a spectacular march which was supported by UNESCO. Disarmed to avoid any form of criticism, the allegorical army danced and sang to the rhythm of the slogans which demanded free education for all, which would also guarantee national unity for a long time to come.
Se me cansa, que no hay espejuelos, que tengo mucha guardia, que los niños no me dejan dormir, todas esas cosas que andan por ahí sueltas. Hay que estudiar de todas.
Guevara was also appointed president of the National Bank of Cuba. His capacity for work became legendary. From time to time he wrote to his parents. "Dear folks, it's 6:30 in the morning and I'm taking a break. It's not the start of the day, but the end. On the other hand, we are the future and we know it. We build with joy, even though we've forgotten